And welcome to Worlds Apart. The anti-corruption protests across Russia have given a jolt to what initially promised to be a slow and uneventful presidential campaign, with thousands of people taking to the streets demanding answers from the number two man in Russia's power hierarchy. What does it leave number one? Well, to discuss that, I'm now joined by Ekaterina Schulmann, a political scientist specializing in the Russian legislative process. Dr. Schulmann, it's great to talk to you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for inviting me.
Now, from what I know, you weren't in Moscow on Sunday, but you certainly followed the story. How much of it surprised you?
It's a part of a role of an expert to be surprised at nothing. And I must say that before I left for Berlin for a conference where I was during the weekend, I was asked by one of the media, what do you think of the oncoming event on Sunday? It's unsanctioned. Will there be many people there? I answered that, events organized by Navalny are usually pretty well successful, so you'd better follow the story. I won't claim the victory of this great prediction, but what was new? Because you can predict a thing and still it's new. Two circumstances. First, the regional impact. Even mass rallies in Moscow and in St. Pete happen from time to time. There's a kind of tradition. But for the regions, the price of the protest is higher. Political culture is usually more restricted. Their circle of activists is more close. So the number of towns, the number of cities that took part in the protest, and the conjunctions of those two agendas, the federal political agenda, the anti-corruption one, and the local social economic agenda, because there was its own set of slogans for every city. And the second circumstance that everyone noticed, young people in the rallies.
Mm-hmm. Now, many of those circumstances have already been discussed on the web, so rather than talking about them again, I want to ask you about the man at the center of this controversy, Russia's Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev, who is now being accused of accumulating assets through an opaque network of charity organizations. And we don't know whether those allegations are true or false, simply because Prime Minister decided not to respond to it directly. Is that what people are reacting to, or is it broader? Because I think in your previous answer, you suggest that it's much broader than just the Prime Minister. How big of a story he is here?
I'm not sure if he is the centerpiece of this protest movement, or even specifically of the events on Sunday. I think the rubber ducks and the sneakers that became symbols were kind of instruments for people to recognize each other, visible symbols. And even the movie that went viral, it was also more of an instrument to draw a circle of people together, to convert viewers into protesters. So I'm not sure it's about Medvedev at all. It is about corruption. It is about the general dissatisfaction with the ruling elite.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned this documentary that was based on that investigation.
I watched that. It was brilliantly done.
And it already got more than 10 million clicks on YouTube. It became a very hot topic on other social media, where Prime Minister Medvedev actually sought to cultivate some presence. And what I want to ask you about is this social media aspect, because many Western analysts like to say that if it didn't happen on state TV and that documentary wasn't aired on state TV, it didn't happen at all. Does this still hold? Is there still sort of a separation between the internet audience and the traditional state channels audience?
I think there is a separation, but it's not that some people watch TV and other people watch YouTube. It's a little bit more complicated than that. It's true that young people also watch TV, but they watch it in a different way. They find programs on the web and watch it there. And even if they come in contact with the state propaganda, specifically with political programs on TV, I think it goes all above their heads, because the tenor of the propaganda is specifically Soviet. Now, it is done by Soviet people for Soviet peoples.
Now, speaking about the state propaganda, many people refer to state-controlled channels as propaganda. Well, Russia Today is sometimes listed within the within this group, even though we did cover the protest extensively. What I would like to ask you about, though, is that the state channels decided not to cover not only the documentary, the allegations, but also the protests themselves. And that is very interesting on the propaganda point of view, because when you're involved in propaganda, you need a narrative to propagate. You actually want to spin events in a certain way that is favorable to you or your stakeholders. This is not happening in this particular case. So essentially, the propaganda function, if you believe that the state channels are exercising, it wasn't done.
Silencing a narrative is one of the tools of propaganda, so it's one scenario that is possible to enact. I wouldn't call that a failure specifically. I'm not a media analyst. I read other media analysts, so I understand that, yes, the decision was to say nothing about what happened in Russia on Sunday. This usually happens when some unexpected event takes place and there are no regulations so far, no, as it is called, metodichkas to go by. So there's a pause. And then, for example, I would expect next weekend the big political talk shows and the big political programs maybe will mention something. Well, when they come up with an alternative narrative, for example, Navalny is using the children, or the State Department is at its old game again. There are a lot of variants, but they need time to think. This is a slow machine.
Well, I don't think that they were so slow to think, for example, when the 2011 protests took place. And what's interesting about this particular protest is... In
2011, RIA Novosti, for example, was not what it is today. Dmitry Medvedev was not the head of the big Россия сегодня. The media landscape was very different.
Well, it may have been different, but the framing, I would argue, is also different, because if you actually look at what the presidential spokesperson Dmitry Peskov has said so far, and he's so far been the only official who commented on that, he didn't blame it on the outside influence. He didn't invoke the Maidan events in Ukraine, which could have been expected.
And even the State Department, I think, wasn't mentioned.
I didn't hear it. And in fact, what struck me is that he sought to portray it as an internal event, that he also said that the authorities are going to respect the right of the people to coalesce, to protest, if it's done within the legal framework. But he said that the protests were lawless,
and he said that the young people were promised money. That was mentioned. But I also noticed that the general formula was exceptionally mild for a top Russian official. I think this may be due to two causes. First, we are in a pre-election era, and you don't crack down on protests with all your might before the elections. You may do it afterwards, as happened in 2012. And the second reason is exactly this involvement of young people. You know how crazy Russians are about their children, how dangerous it is to be seen as repressive towards the younger generation.
I would expect the exact opposite scenario in the pre-election year, because you know better than I do that the Russian officials are extremely sensitive about all the possible regime change scenarios, and perhaps not without a reason. Elections are usually seen as a time when the enemies will seek vulnerabilities in the system, and nobody is alleging just that. Is that because the regime change fears have subsided, or perhaps because everybody thinks that the enemies are too preoccupied with their own domestic affairs?
I think we hear a bit about this on, for example, state radio stations, which have a little bit more leeway than TV. And again, we may hear more about this in future, for example, next weekend. But what is specific about pre-election period is that indeed you need to somehow court the voters. So after you are elected, you can do whatever you want, at least in Russia. But before the elections, and especially having this problem inside that our political top management has with election turnout, they need those votes. They need this energy. But they need it somehow on the polling stations. Those people, especially young people, they don't vote. That is the problem. It was the problem with electing the parliament, but it's twice as much or 10 times as much a problem when you have to elect a president.
If it's so choreographed, as you argue, then why do you think the Kremlin would not provide the state-controlled channels with any sort of instructions on how to approach it. You don't think it was provided? The spokesman of the president, Dmitry Medvedev, also said that they do not intervene in the editorial policies of the state channels. And my own sources actually say that there was no instructions on that particular day.
That's exactly why they're silent, because they have no instructions.
But I wonder if that,
to say.
in a way, could have been a stress test by the Kremlin for the channels to see how the channels may approach that very sensitive issue on the election.
If that's right, I give them joy of the experiment. They have seen the results. Without instructions, they choose just to say nothing.
You wrote a lot about how the Kremlin put a lot of resources, a lot of efforts into consolidating the certain part of the media environment here in Russia. They are state-controlled channels which are expected to, in a way, channel the state view of the events. And yet, what we've seen over the last couple of days is a growth in the audience, in the visibility of alternative media organizations. Meduza, for example, has seen a spike in audience. And that seems very odd from a business point of view. You put a lot of money into consolidating media control only to give all that audience away to your ideological competitors.
I don't think it's the same audience. I think it's a different type of audience. People who habitually watch TV will continue to watch state TV. It's an elderly and aging audience, but we are an elderly and aging population. With all this new hype about young people and school children, etc., the demographic pyramid hasn't changed.
But I don't share that hype about young people, because the internet penetration in Russia is above 70%. In many ways, thanks to President Medvedev, who promoted this program of fiber optic cables around Russia. So the penetration is very young. And even my mother, who is not in any way a target audience for Alexei Navalny, she read the news on the internet. And she is a traditional viewer of state channels. She votes for Putin on every occasion. And yet she somehow got the wind of the story. I assume that there would be more and more people like that. Don't you think that it is perhaps too reductive to make it all only about the young people?
No, that was not my idea. My idea was that TV audience will remain TV audience. But as you noticed correctly, and I've also read that there were surprisingly many views of this movie about Medvedev on Odnoklassniki, social media, which is specifically for older women and men to a less extent. However, for a state channel, for a state political program, it's more important to be right on the lines than to extend or even to retain its audience. They are risk-averse for a reason. So they'll miss a few days, but then they'll catch up.
So you don't actually think that there could be any consequences for them, because in my view, missing the ball on an important and sensitive story is a much bigger risk than reporting something that may not sit well with one or two officials.
As I said before, I'm not a media analyst, and again, I can't judge of the state of mind of top media management. I don't know. But what I see is the general, aging autocracy. A rather tired power structure, which is not in any way crumbling or falling apart, but it's not in its spring, to say at least. And the same careful and timorous and risk-averse propaganda machine. It has been painted as particularly aggressive or powerful or whatever, but we see that they also try to keep to the safe side.
Okay, Dr. Schulmann, we have to take a very short break now, but when we come back, the Russian power system may seem monolithic, but recently it's been incrementally changed from within. Can the street pressure help accelerate that process? That's coming up in a moment on Worlds Apart. Stay tuned.
Here's what people have been saying about Redacted tonight.
Give it to us.
Redacted is full-on awesome. The only show I go out of my way to watch every week. It really packs a punch. Lee Camp is the John Oliver of RT America.
You guys do have the same accent.
Hey, we are apparently better than boobs.
Nothing's better than boobs.
You see, people you've never heard of, love Redacted Tonight. The president of the World Bank, though, hates it.
He doesn't really have any taste.
Seriously, he sent us an email.
The European Union proclaims a democratic cause, but its real decisions don't always comply.
It is an ideology, it's an anti-government ideology, and it's deeply embedded in the construction of the Eurozone. It's also, if I may say so, not just an anti-government ideology, it's an anti-democratic ideology. It's a belief that actually you cannot trust democracies not to spend money.
The referendums have a meaning when their results don't fit the goal. This can be called a coup.
What happened in Ireland, Italy, Greece, I think one could easily call a silent coup d'etat.
È stato un vero e proprio colpo di Stato.
But not everyone is ready for this term.
I would not use the word coup. I would call it the way the system works.
Welcome back to Worlds Apart. We are discussing the recent events in Russia with Ekaterina Schulmann, a Russian political scientist. Dr. Schulmann, you've got an interesting course on the web about the rebuilding of the Russian state, the centralization of powers, the consolidation of media, the strengthening of the law enforcement apparatus, this phase of sort of picking up the pieces of the Russian state that was demolished with the collapse of the Soviet Union. Is that state still continuing? And do you think in the minds of the Kremlin policymakers, is that stage still continuing, or is it time to move on to something new?
My course is specifically dedicated to the political history of 2000, of those 12 years from 2000 till 2012. As I have just said about this being a rather tired power structure, in my opinion, for example, the protests of 2011-2012 were the result of this objective political social protest where society moves one way and the state apparatus either stays in place or moves another way. These developments have been on different trajectories. Sadly or ironically, it was because of the same factors, for example, because of the growing consumption level or growing economy, which fed the bureaucracy and which also enabled the people to have new needs and to have new desires besides pure consumerism.
But I think there have also been some efforts on the part of the Kremlin to rejuvenate that state apparatus. There has been a number of high-profile appointments of, people who are described as technocrats in the Russian media. There has also been a number of high-profile arrests of people who have previously been thought of as untouchables. Do you see any organizing principle behind that?
I don't see any organized scenario. I do not much believe in scenarios. I see the Russian power structure as a conglomerate of interest groups who generally fight with each other. This competition, intra-governmental, intra-ministerial, between various ministries, between various powers, is what we have in place of political competition, in place of free public policy. It's not quite the same thing, but it works as well.
provides a certain amount of checks and balances within the system.
Yes, it does provide a certain system of checks and balances. It's worse than developed democracy. It doesn't work as well, but it works, again, as well as it can. So we have this war of all against all. About the new appointments, about the new technocrats, I've been watching the process since the middle of 2014, when economic crisis struck for the first time, and I've seen those attempts to replace old expensive management with new, less expensive and supposedly more effective people. The system wants to find those managers that are seen as both loyal and competent.
Well, it's an interesting question, because especially this issue of loyalty, because the Russian state is highly influenced by the professional culture of the law enforcement, security services, and it's a complex value system where loyalty plays a very, very important role.
And treachery is the first of sins.
Yeah, and I think it can also help the process and arrest the process in certain ways, because
what process?
The governmental process, or the process of appointing new managers, because a number of analysts have suggested that in his recent appointments, Putin has or seemed to be putting higher emphasis, a higher premium on efficiency rather than loyalty. Do you see it that way, or is it just...
All those people are from within the system. None of them are outsiders. Their careers follow more or less the same trait. They were, if we are talking about the new governors, for example, they all were in business in the 90s. They all were on federal employ in 2000. They are more or less well educated, and they have not been seen in any political activity. So I think they all have passed the loyalty test. As for their efficiency, we'll have yet to see to that. My chief quarrel with this kind of appointments is that as governors, they do not represent the people. They are not elected. And they see the appointments as a kind of place to show their value and to be taken back to Moscow to be, for example, I don't know, federal ministers. And this is bad enough because a governorship may be a step on the ladder, but it has to be a step because you were elected by the people and you represent their interests. They are outsiders for those territories.
But, that works... in theory, when you have already a self-sustaining system of governance, democratic governance, I don't think you would claim at this point of time that Russia's system is mature. It may be making strides in that direction, and we can argue whether it's making or not.
I wouldn't call it strides.
Well, anyway, I mean, you live in this country, I live in this country. I think we all would hope that Russia one day could be self-sustaining. Well, maybe whatever, But it's semantics. I mean, at the end of the day, I think even, people in the Kremlin recognize that the system in this current shape or form, and they have actually been on record about that the system needs to be reformed, that the existing heavy law enforcement, private interest-based security apparatus is not sustainable. It's simply too expensive for Russia, and you need to move forward beyond that.
There has been certain attempts to hear signals from society or feedback from reality and to try to adapt the system to the needs of new economic environment. Our political regime as such is adaptable enough. It may not be progressive. Regimes of these types are not very much friendly to progress. They are not modernistic in this sense, but they are agile and adaptable. They can change, if not fast, but far enough, in order to survive, in order to remain what they are in essential. They are ready, for example, to change their rhetorics. They are ready to change their outsides. They are ready for a number of even liberalizing steps, as we have seen, for example, in 2011. After this came another political wave, but still, we may expect something of this kind again before the elections, in a pre-election period, especially since turnout is such a crucial problem.
Can I ask you one question about Vladimir Putin? Because he, I think, is an interesting character to analyze, because he has a propensity to both risk-taking and risk aversion. You alluded earlier to that, and he usually takes significant risks in the foreign policy arena that provided him with a competitive advantage on some level. But when it comes to domestic policy, he's very, very risk-averse. Do you think his successes on the international arena may sort of inspire a more resolute action on the domestic front, especially given that he himself recognized that Russia needs to move towards reforming itself, its economy, its social institutions, even its political system?
We have seen enough decisive steps in interior policy. For example, after the presidential elections of 2012, the new Duma that was elected in the end of 2011 spent 2 years building new repressive legislation in the field of laws about meetings, laws about media, laws about NGOs. They were all about repressing the protest, and they have succeeded for a time. Now we are politically sort of back again in the end of 2011, but with the system, again, not younger than it was 5 years ago, with a lot of its resources spent, and with a quite different and pretty bad, to put it frankly, economic situation, especially as regards people's incomes. This has been diminishing.
They've been falling for 2 straight years.
For 2 straight years, and the speed of this downward trajectory was higher in 2016 than it was in 2015.
So there is a pressure, an objective pressure on the regime to change, whether you like it or not, whether it likes it or not.
That's my point, and this seems to me objective reality, which we'd better watch instead of trying to analyze somebody's head. I think that in the long run, there's no alternative to democratization, because Russia is a big country. Let me tell you something new for a change. It's mainly a country of city dwellers. These people who live in cities, they do not see themselves represented on any level of political structure. They are not represented in the parliament. No party talks to them. They do not see any leaders who would talk to them. And this is not some kind of middle class or creative class. It's just educated people living in towns. Their political views may be diverse, but what they need is to hear something that is important for them. The foreign policy agenda has been entertaining enough for a time, but the audience has evidently been growing tired of this recently.
The state has been addressing, I mean, let's admit, both the state and city officials have been very active on the various urbanization fronts. There have been a number of initiatives to improve the environment, the city environment in Moscow. There's also a new program of resettling people who live in this
Don't you think it rather scares
houses?
the people, the scope of this program, and the vagueness and the uncertainty about what house will be demolished and what not, and what people get? Do you think it's something they want to hear, not something that scares them?
No, my point is that I think there has been some efforts to appeal to that kind of electorate, to appeal to its needs.
And many of these efforts have been sadly misplaced. The feedback channels are very much lacking. The natural feedback channels of a healthy political systems are free media, regular elections on all levels, especially on a local level, which is tremendously important, and the free operation of NGOs. On all three, we have huge problems. So yes, the system is trying to hear something, but it's like a person with something on its head. It hears certain signals, but it hears a lot of white noise or a lot of echoes of its own voice.
Do you see it moving, as you said, you see the baby steps? Is it the baby steps forward or the baby steps backwards?
I see a certain growth of diversity within the bureaucratic elites, more centers of decision-making. I think the end of the monopoly of presidential administration as chief governor of all political sphere. So we have, in a way, we have more diversity, and one of the signs of this diversity is this war of all against all that I have also mentioned. Is it a step? Is it a voluntary step? Or is it just something that is naturally happening to a system that is more than a little behind the times?
Well, I don't know. I guess we will have to wait and see, but at least I think some people would claim that people taking to the streets and demanding answers from the authorities is already inspiring enough. Whether or not the authorities will heed that call.
I agree with that, and I would also point your attention to the nature of this protest in, again, demanding answers about corruption, about breaking of the law. The protests of 2011 were also about breaking of law, about falsifications of elections. This, I think, speaks volumes about the real stage of development of our society, because there are very different types of protests. There's a protest of burn down the house type. Our protest is not like that. It's a kind of a new development stage of the famous Soviet dissident slogan, keep your own constitution.
Well, that is a good note to end our conversation on. Thank you very much for being here. And to our viewers, please share your comments on our Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook pages. And I hope to see you again, same place, same time, here on Worlds Apart.
We'll be right back.